Hey, power people. Welcome to Renewable Rides. I'm Gareth Evans.
And I'm Dan Roberts. We're the founding team of VECKTA, a platform and marketplace streamlining how companies buy on-site energy.
In each episode, we'll uncover the latest trends, challenges, and triumphs relating to the energy transition through the experiences of our team and our inspiring guests.
Our goal is to help companies take action to create a resilient, profitable, sustainable, and thriving energy future.
Let's go.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Renewable Rides. And today we are honored to be joined by John Cooper, who is a smart grid pioneer. He's been at this for longer than most of us have even known about smart grids and on-site energy. He is an author and he's an all-around awesome human. And it's a pleasure to have you on today, John.
It's a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, Gareth.
So, John, we always start with what are you passionate about? So we'd love to, what motivates you? What drives you? What are you excited about today?
You know, I think from the get-go, I've been passionate about change almost forever, change process. In business school back 30 years ago, you know, I took a course on organizational change. It was one of my favorite courses, and in the process of change. And of course, innovation and disruption have been key. I'm a little bit anti-convention, anti-authoritarian, and so I like the idea of disruption. And that's made me stand out a little bit in the utility field, I think, where change tends to happen very incrementally for any number of reasons. And so I've been a little bit of the guy throwing sand in the gears.
It very much aligns. One of our core values is challenge limits. And that's all about disrupting the status quo. And I think you're absolutely spot on. How do we disrupt an industry that's very used to working the same way it has for pretty much a decade or more? A century or more.
I've written so many articles, but one of the articles I remember comparing, I like golf. And believe it or not, now in my dotage, I like to watch golf on TV. And I said, if utility executives, I have a lot, you know, right out of the gate, I have a lot of respect for utility executives, what it took to get them where they are and the businesses they manage. But I said, if they were sports figures, they'd probably be professional golfers, because they're not rewarded for, you know, incredible talent to hit three-point shots, although they do showcase incredible talent. They're often rewarded for doing the same thing over and over. You know, in the utility business, it's about consistency. In golf, it's about having a good, repeatable golf swing and just doing it, executing it over and over. And that's where this critical challenge comes in the industry that I've written a lot about, which is, what do we do when disruption says a lot of what you've learned doesn't apply anymore? Or I've written a lot about the pace of change, and I call it the pace problem, is that when you look at all these other industries, and just think about Amazon or Apple or whomever, right? Big innovators out there, big successful companies, and what they do to disrupt themselves, Google, and in the pace of change they consider appropriate, and the things they manage to accomplish. And then you look at the utility field, and they're very careful, because their business model depends upon continuity and stability, and words like reliability and resilience. And they, in their business model, especially with regulatory commissions, is there another business model where decisions they made 3 years ago can come back up to them and challenged and disallowed? That's how a rate case works. And it makes the utility culture very conservative and risk averse.
John, what? Maybe we rewind a bit further. Where do you think this innate nature to disrupt things came from? Where'd you grow up?
I'm old. I'm probably older than most of your audience. I got one foot in retirement, but I had a lot of fun in my youth. I traveled around the world, and I think like Gareth, I had a lot of adventures in my 20s. And when I finally settled down, I got a BA in government, and ended up running a research office at the Texas Senate. So I had public background and the legislative arena, and then I got an MBA when I got married in the early 90s, and with a career redirect, decided to go to business school. I got a top 20 MBA from University of Texas, and I was recruited, of all things. Keep in mind, I'm in Austin, Texas, and I didn't follow my colleagues in taking a job at Dell in 1996 when that was the quickest path to become a millionaire. Not me, because I didn't know that much about technology. I was a government guy. And so I took a job in an electric utility where I knew nothing about electricity. So that didn't make a lot of sense. But I got offered a job in the regulatory department of a really innovative utility called Central and Southwest, which was they call it a PUCA utility, Public Utility Holding Company Act. It was one of the it was a different set of regulations for these companies. It was a holding company set up by Samuel Insull, who was the first CEO of ComEd and was the head of, here's the cat. The cat usually makes an appearance. Samuel Insull was one of the top four, like Tesla and Westinghouse and Edison. Insull came up with the regulated business model and also came up with a holding company model where a trust back then in the 20s or holding company would own geographic utilities, power, Dayton Power and Light, whatever, all the power and lights. And so you had a few owners owning several businesses, highly leveraged. And then when FDR came in as the Depression was raging, they broke up these utility holding companies under the Public Utility Holding Company Act. So Central and Southwest was in Dallas, but had four subsidiaries. And I was on the regulatory team in Austin. And 2 years into that, they transferred me into the new communications subsidiary, which had been a lot of big utilities were launching communication subs because they had a lot of fiber. And this was the telecom revolution, and they passed the Federal Telecom Act in 1996 that allowed utilities to get into telecom. And so I went over to run state of government affairs there. And it turned out to be one of the most innovative utilities in the US. So from 96 to 2000, 5 years, I was tackling all these major issues. We called it retail wheeling, retail competition. We were working with Enron in California. It was the advent of wireless meter reading. It was called AMR back then, automated meter reading. And I did, at the time, Itron had the predominant technology, which was a van going down the alley and taking wireless signals from all the meters. And a company called Cellnet, a real pioneer, developed mesh networks that would collect the data using new wireless technology. And so I did one of the first citywide wireless networks for the city of Tulsa. It didn't get approval. CSW was getting acquired by AEP. So since the 2000, CSW has been part of AEP's Southwestern region, the big utility out of Columbus. So in 2000, I left to get into the dot-com boom, just in time for the dot-com bust. And so you can see a pattern here. But it led me at this point in my career, I wanted to do something not utility, and I got out and did a lot of research about the internet. The internet was brand new, and I don't know if you guys can remember, but there were some magazines that were 250 pages thick because the number of ads they were selling, and the internet was going to change everything. And so being a government researcher, I got out and researched the internet up and down so I could go out and interview, and ended up getting a job at Dell finally, doing managed services for a couple of years, made a fair amount of money, and left to go out on my own. And I was recruited by Austin Energy to come in as a consultant. So I'd had all that experience at Central and Southwest for 5 years on innovation. And it was the right place at the right time. The CIO was new and was coming in to shake things up. And I came in on a communications contract. This is hard to imagine, but back then utilities had all kinds of telecom facilities, but Austin Energy had 17 different networks that they had to manage. And I suggested that we take a long, hard look at IP networks, wired and wireless, and said, why doesn't each division share a piece of this company-wide network? And then once you had that network, you could tell the application providers that, thank you, we have our own communication solution. I don't need your 400 kilohertz or whatever. communication systems, very specific and tied to the application and the specialized equipment, I can just buy the app. And so it was a much more modern approach. And while I was doing that, we said, why don't we also look at a common information store for the field and the enterprise? And so when you think about it, I've just described what we now call the smart grid, which is very much integrated data across the whole enterprise and integrated communications across the whole enterprise, and which allows all kinds of benefits in terms of streamlining the utility operations. And we ended up calling that project the Genie Project for Geodesic Energy Networks, Information plus Electricity. And a geodesic energy network is a mesh network. It's how you describe the internet, as opposed to, say, the utility, which is a linear network or a radial network, more like a tree, right, with trunk and limbs and branches for one-way power delivery. So I often described what we were doing as a tree, the utility, with a spider web laid over the top of it, which was the mesh network of the communications. And that's kind of, I think, still a pretty valid definition of what the smart grid would be. And that was 2004, 2005, about 20 years ago.
Yeah, John. So you went on to write the Advanced Smart Grid book, and I think that came out in 2011. And the definition that I saw in the book, it says the smart grid is the integration of an electric grid, a communication network, software and hardware to monitor, control, and manage the creation, distribution, and storage of energy.
Yeah.
And I like that you say it allows a seamless integration of utility power with buildings, homes, electric vehicles, distribution generation, energy storage, smart devices, and it'll drive greater grid reliability, energy efficiency, renewable energy use, and customer satisfaction, while also reducing capital and operating costs.
And that's a mouthful. I wrote that.
Yeah.
No, what was fascinating, Gareth, it's fun to think back. I left in 2005 with a finished project and got out doing citywide Wi-Fi. So I was a bunch of communications consultant for a company. Did that for several years, but it relied on this new Wi-Fi standard. And of course, when telecoms came out with 4G, they got in the business of moving data around. And city mayors pulled back from that. A company called Earthlink had been a key driver. So when the bottom fell out of that in 2008, I got back into energy and looked at what Austin Energy was doing. And by that time, renewable energy was expensive, but there were some pioneers out there. And I actually got a job with a college friend who was a pioneer in energy storage with advanced lead acid with a company called Extreme Power. And I came in on a contract to help them write up all their research R&D. They've been an R&D company for several years, and they got, with First Wind, they got a very large DOE loan guarantee to do the first integrated storage on the island of Maui with a megawatt storage facility to take care of wind ramping. Real big problem trying to harness wind on a small grid like Maui's island grid. And so the storage kind of acted like a shock absorber or a buffer. And while I was doing that, Andres, the CIO at Austin Energy, Andres Carvalho, called me and asked me to come in on a really interesting project called the Pecan Street Project. So this was a second project at Austin Energy, where we were looking at, as a city-owned utility, we were looking at the innovative use of distributed energy, DER is a new term, to create economic development opportunities for the city. We had Austin had had great success with personal computing and chips in the past, and we thought we could do the same thing with energy. So I came in and ran the systems integration team, which we ended up calling the Smart Grid team, for 6 months. And then I ended up writing the technical report for that project. And that was, if you recall, that was right when Barack Obama had been elected and the bottom had fallen out of the economy. And they launched, it was the stimulus bill. And the big driver, I think a lot of the money from the stimulus bill went to AMI, wireless projects. Both Austin Energy and the Pecan Street Project applied for grants, and Pecan Street Project got the grant. And so by the end of 2009, they were really focused on launching a nonprofit, and they've since become a research nonprofit at a new neighborhood in the center of Austin, airport infill neighborhood. So I was hired by Sharp Labs to do some really pioneer work on virtual power plant business modeling in 2009, 2010, just imagine. And of course, I think that the listeners probably know a virtual power plant is a combination of the demand side and the supply side to provide managed electricity consumption and production that could be a substitute for a peaking power plant. And it's actually BPP is getting a lot of attention from the DOE and others now. I think the technology's come a long way in 15 years. But about that time, Andres called, and we had talked about writing a book, and he had publisher contacts. And so we outlined and set out to write the Advanced Smart Grid to sort of document what we had done, the pioneer work at the Genie Project and the Pecan Street Project.
And so you were thinking and seeing and doing that work, 15, 20 years ago. What's your vision for how this plays out? And then would love to hear what the barriers to this gaining scale and momentum are.
It's funny when you get to be at this stage in life or whatever your career. I did a backward look and redid my resume because it's crazy. It's a lot of projects, as you know, and it's primarily been projects. And I've kind of had this pattern of launching a company and not getting financing, and then going back out and doing some consulting on a new project. And it's given me this widely diverse background. But I'm amazed at 15, 20 years how far we've come. I mean, with issues like AI and energy transition. And I was just reading about 1.3 cent per kilowatt hour or per kilowatt capacity solar in Abu Dhabi or something, this massive solar field. That's incredible, but I'm very frustrated and disappointed at the pace of change and where we could be, because I've been, even 20 years ago, I cited an Economist article about the energy web, a very high level R&D idea. And I've been a proponent of what we might call the internet or the energy internet since, and I've written various articles. And a few years back, friend Stuart McCafferty wrote a book called The Energy Internet Reference Architecture, and I edited that for him. So I'd love to see us further along. I think I see that as one of the next generation aspects of the smart grid. A key challenge we've run into that's really slowed things down has been the issue of data acquisition. If you're going to have a digital operations, it's going to rely on data. And while the AMI systems have churned out massive amounts of data, that has become a liability, a requirement for the utilities to deal with it and protect it and store it. We haven't really leveraged that data as far as we could to drive change inside the utility. And so that remains one of the key challenges, especially now with AI coming along.
John, can you paint a picture for people that aren't really aware of those terms? Like what's exciting and what's possible with the concept of the energy web or the smart grid of the future?
We come from a legacy world where I call it analog, where things were purposely separated, whether it's a SCADA system or whatever. And along comes wireless AMI and says, we're going to take this digital technology with communications and substitute a manual process of reading to digital reading, right, with communication networks. Well, the minute we start to digitize all these processes and then interconnect it with the internet, in a mission critical network like the grid, we open ourselves up to massive cybersecurity risks and so on that didn't exist before, because we had this term called air gaps, where you just weren't connected to the internet, so you could isolate your systems. So we have, I think, as yet unrecognized, and we sit on the edge of some pretty horrible consequences with physical and cyber risks associated with our critical network. And so far, we've dodged the bullet. There have been a few attacks and attempts here and there that we've heard about. But the future of running something as complex as the grid is not controlling it ever tighter and having old experienced hands in the control room to make decisions. It's moving to software systems like ADMS and things like that in the control room, so that we can lean on the value of data and data processing and smart systems and start to shift a lot of our operations away from man operations to machine operations. And this is really the promise of AI, is being able to shift over all that complexity and that increasing complexity to an AI platform or a software platform. But in order to make that transition, it would be facilitated by having new structure similar to the internet for the energy grid. And it's a real challenge physically, because the whole system is designed to move bulk power from a remote area across down cascading voltages to a distribution network and individual meters, not like the internet. And yet we're moving to a position of massive numbers of on-site solar systems, on-site batteries, on-site EV charging systems, all interconnected at the distribution level. And the utilities are not well set up to deal with that. So we have an ongoing conundrum, which is interconnection queuing, getting the approvals to connect these systems. They require, in some places, complex engineering studies, very long queue times, and it's very frustrating for those that would interconnect with the grid. So it acts as it dampens or inhibits the growth of DER in some ways. So for us to manage the growth at the pace we need to for climate change and to deal with decarbonization, we need help. And that's where we call them the 4Ds: digitalization, democratization, decarbonization, and decentralization. And you see that in a lot of consulting literature now, those 4Ds. But with decarbonization driving it, with wildfires and so on, we need to make changes. That's going to come from decentralized units, and we need to find ways to integrate those units into the system that's designed for very large centralized units. We run into problems like interconnection queuing, but also new economic models, new rate-based systems that encounter something called transactive energy. How can all these small players find ways to make the most out of their investment in their small systems? And it's not going to be through net metering, in my opinion, which leaves the utility in charge as a single buyer. But being able to sell peer-to-peer energy, and in order to do things like that, think about that, that's how the internet operates. And so we need to move towards a new paradigm or a new system. I'm gonna put a plug in. I ran into a really interesting company called Grokkit, Grokit. You guys can search it. That's looking at a new paradigm associated with workforce management and machine and human interconnection that could really open up, I think, a lot of new avenues in the electric grid.
Super interesting, John. One of the things many of our listeners are business leaders, and they're over the last couple years, I think, being forced to think about energy more than they ever had before. And you said it yourself, like the pace of change of the utilities is not where it needs to be, and that's largely due to their frameworks and regulators and everything. But so put yourself in the shoes of some of these large business leaders with dozens of facilities scattered around the country across many different utilities. How should they be thinking about this? Like, should we hear sometimes, oh, the utilities, if I'm on a decarbonization effort, the utility is going to clean it up, or I'm concerned that we have outages in certain places, but this seems like a growing concern for me. Should I be waiting for the utility to come up with these solutions, or what should I be doing as a business leader to optimize my operations?
I think big or small, a business leader is responsible for continuity of the business, for profitability, for so many things. And the buck sort of stops with the CEO. And at least that's what the board would say, I think. And with regard to energy, it's this sleeper issue that's complicated. Anyone that's followed the Paris Accords and the UN process for climate change knows that we set these goals and then we don't meet them. And carbon production keeps going up, and we're too slow to get off of coal. And now there's a big debate about natural gas. ESG is another, so many acronyms in this industry, but ESG, environmental, social, and governmental goals are being put on CEOs by their boards, and they have to clean up. They have to really think about where their energy is coming from. There's a term called energy justice that's out there. And there are these big issues associated with energy, and to think that I can just pay my utility bills and then leave that up to the utilities to take care of is to cede a lot of the control of your business to a third party. And I think it represents unacceptable risk. So these business leaders, what are they to do? I think you need to up your game, open up to new ideas, a lot more shift to considering resilience, which is the take blackouts out of the equation. What do you do if you're a small business guy in 100 miles north of San Francisco in PG&E territory, and they said the way we're going to deal with these wildfires is we're just going to have enforced outages that could last 2 or 3 weeks?
That's exactly where I grew up, 100 miles north of San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm very familiar. Yeah. And it's
like,
unacceptable.
Talk about in between a rock and a hard place. Do you want power to run your business, or do you want wildfires or disruptions? You want neither. So you're almost impressed to get into the energy business yourself. And that's where your business comes in, looking at microgrids and the tremendous potential. I wrote a report for DOE last year, and I lumped microgrids and VPPs, virtual power plants, in the same category because they both deal with very small. They're both strategies for aggregation of very small power production into larger, more manageable systems. A microgrid, principally from the end user's perspective, that's going to offer tremendous benefits on reliability and resilience, and maybe their decarbonization strategy, and on and on. But from the utilities perspective, tremendous opportunity to harness all these new systems into a virtual power plant, and we've got the technology there, we've got the data processing to manage massive numbers of disaggregated or decentralized energy units that aren't on the same site. I'd say microgrids are typically located on a campus or a single site. Virtual power plants can be across a region and not have geographic coterminous facilities. So, I think it's time to step up, and I think that's what makes this really interesting. And that comes under what we call the other D, democratization. Is now all of a sudden, for the first time in this long history, 140 years of electricity, it's not the primary realm of large monopolies or large systems, large institutions. Increasingly, it's becoming the potential in my house. I've got a new metal roof, and I'm going to put a solar system on, and I've got a Tesla in the garage. And why wouldn't I set up a system with some on-site power to shift the power center to my garage rather than an electric meter on my wall, so that I have a pico grid in my home and I've got 2 rooms that will never be without energy? That was an R&D project 15 years ago when we were writing about it hypothetically in the advanced smart grid, but now it's reality. There are companies that'll do that for you, and there are companies that'll do that for businesses. And the big challenge is the cost. And the other thing is the focus and what's required to get yourself up to speed. For the longest time, the passive consumer was supposed to focus on the load, get efficient with LEED certified buildings and efficient equipment and better insulation to lower their cost of electricity and their utility bill. But now it's a combination of adding that smart consumption to on-site production. And now imagine integrating that with, I call it a critical energy system, but a microgrid. And now you're actually using the grid as your backup power, where most of the time you have your critical energy needs isolated. I use an acronym CRISIS, but I envision 3 segments of your energy. One is critical, never want it to fail. That's ensured by your backup power systems to become always run. And then you have prioritized energy, which if you could afford it, you would add that to your collection of what you'd like to run and never have fail. And then you have discretionary energy. And these are systems that, yeah, you can do without it for a week or so. It's not going to break the bank. So this is looking more sophisticated at load. That's one of the first things I think business owners should do. And then second, they should take a long, hard look at never having a blackout again, because blackouts are coming. I think that, did you see the Warren Buffett article about a month ago where, Berkshire Hathaway has several utilities, and Buffett wrote an article about utility bankruptcies that are resulting from wildfires. They cited Pacific Gas and Electric in Portland, but also PG&E in Northern California, HECO in Hawaii, their lawsuits associated with that horrific fire in Maui. This massive wildfire we had in North Texas, Panhandle, a month or so ago, it came out, it was attributed to some XL power systems, arcing and so on. And what Buffett argued was utilities, long the darling of pension funds, high dividend utilities with good, stable operations, the safe stock to own. He said, I think those days are changing, and it may be time for pension funds to reevaluate where utilities fit in their portfolio, and maybe we may see some divestment. So change is afoot, and the old way of operating the grid and utilities, I think, are on the way to not being seen as stable and reliable as they used to be. And business owners need to think about that. And the idea that wildfires are only going to occur out in California or hurricanes in Florida, that this climate change is some isolated event that we're safe where we are. I don't think it's safe anymore. I think we're seeing fires in the Northwest Canada and Northeast Canada, everywhere, right? Wherever there's drought and extreme heat, and the idea of a spark from an electric system could set off a fire. There you go. So who's not at risk anymore? I think we're all at risk. I'll stop my monologue there. Take a breath.
As you play this out, John, do you see the need? Like, there's billions and billions of dollars being sunk into major transmission infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Is that required in the smart grid of the future, or is it interconnection at the distribution level and someone just helping to coordinate the distribution grid?
Well, I would push back on the either or. I think they're both required. One of the key challenges we have is that the government and large equity funds or whatever tend to gravitate to utilities as the go-to, right? They're the energy experts in any region. And the utilities, based on their business model, love to get new assets into their rate base that they can get a return on. And one of the biggest assets is a transmission system, build big transmission. And so they consequently make a strong argument. There's a lot of reasons for it, but it's also somewhat self-serving, is that one of the best ways we could go to the utility commission and say we need $2 billion, $5 billion in new transmission infrastructure so that we can bring renewable energy from 400 miles away into our population centers and import that real cheap power. That fits their current business model, large remote systems that require massive investment in transmission and distribution infrastructure. But it's also the case that these small systems are proliferating. And whether it's a cul-de-sac with 4 EV chargers in the garage like I have, or solar panels, we used to talk about that, where you have multiple edge-based systems, storage, that require investment in the distribution grid, whether it's transformer upgrades or storage on the lines or storage in the distribution substations. It all has to happen. And is one a priority over the other? I think it's going to depend on the strategy. And that shifts to another big issue, which is planning. Planning is ever more critical. And we're seeing terms like distribution system planning to model IRP, integrated resource planning, which traditionally was for when do we have to build our next big coal-fired power plant. to meet our load over the next 5 years. And now we're seeing DRP as a term of distribution resource planning. And what do we need to do with our feeders and our distribution substations to manage growth inside? And there's SIME and other software products that are used for running modeling for distribution systems. And there's the potential for, I think, an entire new strategic approach that we might call, instead of ADMS, ADPS, Advanced Distribution Planning Systems, which are going to put together this balance between how much do we invest in the transmission grid and how much do we invest in the distribution grid, and how do we accommodate these changes.
And then I think circling right back to Dan's question originally, if you were a business leader today with a manufacturing facility or an operation, would you be waiting for that to happen and letting the utilities figure that out? Or would you be taking action into your own hands and trying to get ahead of it and pre-position your business for reliable, profitable operations?
I think at a minimum, every business owner needs to do a survey of their critical energy needs and energy uses and secure that. They need to do the scenario analysis of what's it going to be like if we lose power for a month. If especially if you're living in a city like Houston or something like that, where you can get pasted with 50 inches of rain and a disastrous hurricane. But increasingly all over the place, and not assume that just because the electricity's always been there, that it always will be, or just because the utility reports really strong SAIDI and SAIFI numbers on indicating top quartile performance. That's no guarantee of future performance. And this is where resilience becomes a much bigger issue. So I think resilience surveys and how resilient are we will become a bigger and bigger issue. And it has to go hand in hand with how clean we are, how are we taking carbon out of our energy supply, but also how are we taking risk out of our energy supply. And that simply means elevating. I once had a guy tell me he was selling energy systems into small businesses, energy management systems. And he goes, my big challenge is I talked to the CFO and he says, Dan, I've got 10 issues a year I can focus on, and energy is my 11th issue every year. I just don't have time to look at energy because it's not that critical. It's affordable. I pay my bill and it's there. I think those days are numbered.
So I want to pull on one thing there that you just hit on, which is days are gone. And the piece that you said they're affordable. One of the things that you said a few minutes ago was around these $2 billion, $5 billion rate cases. And the utility business model is built on deploying capital and getting returns on that capital. That is one of the most common things we talk about with business leaders is they're seeing their rates go up. And these are not just California. I'm sitting here in California and yes, we are feeling the burn there. But companies that have operations throughout the Southeast saying my bills have gone up 40, 50% over the last 2 or 3 years. How do you see that playing out over the next 5 to 10 years, that especially now that we're seeing for the first time in 15, 20 years, load growth on the grid, because net load growth has remained relatively the same. What do you see that transpiring?
Well, just imagine under decarbonization, we use the term full electrification. As we shift away from fossil fuel burning, from fossil fuels for transportation, from natural gas used in building heating, shifting over to inductive loads, electricity. Yes, loads are going to go up. What about AI? I mean, it is insane. The data center requirements, the advances by NVIDIA and for all those power hungry chips. And where's the power going to come for all those data centers? Where's the power going to come from shifting? We're at 10%? I don't even know the percentage of EVs now, but as we shift over very rapidly in the next 5 or 10 years, that's brand new load that's coming in. And so you got to go, Dan? All right.
Yeah, I'm going to slip away. Thank you.
So that was a great last question. But yeah, load growth, get used to it. get used to it. Rates are going up, and that will put more and more pressure on business leaders to manage energy as a cost center. In addition to decarbonization and the resilience I talked about. So I think electricity is moving up and then what about fleets, electric fleets? It's moving up as a critical issue. And this means all business leaders are going to have to up their game about it and take on more responsibility.
Yeah, love it. And agree. John, as we close out, we like to ask if you could be any energy technology, what would it be and why? So based on your experiences, what do you think is going to make them the biggest impact?
I'm reflecting back. I once had a conversation about 10 years ago with a professor at Carnegie Mellon who had a company that he managed to sell. He had a bunch of PhDs, but we were opining about what was coming. Just think back in the dark ages of 2012 or something. And he goes, there's going to come a time when utilities are mostly managed by computers. They're not going to be managed by human beings. And what does that mean? Well, right now, when you look at the labor background of utilities, how many employees are in bill production? How many employees are in vegetation management? Look at who are the employees at the utility and how are the employees run? Some of these real simple co-ops, they have some bills and retail employees, and they have some vegetation management, and they maybe have one or two substations, and they buy their power. It's a pretty simple business, but it's made up of a lot of business of people. And you've heard about AI having the potential to replace a lot of the labor in our new economy as it really ramps up. I think tremendous potential in the utility industry, where we have an aging workforce, to automate a lot of these functions through software, but also through shifting over to support from AI. And so I think the frontier is very exciting with AI to get us. And what stands in the way? Full digitalization. You can't, garbage in, garbage out with bad data. If you don't have good data, you're lost in the AI world. So to take advantage of that, we're going to see a split between utilities that are getting their data act together and utilities that are not ready for prime time. And those that are going to move ahead. So I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation. I can see utility bankruptcies in the future where some utilities just don't make it. I don't know what the time frame is. Who does on AI, right? But I think the most exciting thing, and maybe one of the most scary things, is what is AI going to do to what may be one of the most mission critical infrastructures in our modern economy and society, which is the electric grid.
Yep.
And there's no running away from it. There's no running away from the impacts of climate change and disruption. There's no running away from the disruption potential of these kind of business changes driven by technology. And that's why I kind of wish I was 20 years younger, like you, because this is a really exciting time to be around.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff we made theories about 15, 20 years ago is now right here, right in front of us. And it's critical.
It's amazing how it can be applied everywhere, can't it? Like we're seeing on our side of the fence, stuff that was taking us as consultants 6 to 12 months to analyze is now done in seconds and minutes. Mm-hmm. And then you scale that out across the whole ecosystem.
But where we run into, even with those sort of amazing time differences that we're seeing, where we run into is these organizational constraints of getting an IT organization inside a utility. Pick a large investor-owned utility with 10,000 employees or whatever, getting them to the point where they have a really tight handle on their data.
Yep.
Common data systems, data warehouses, the ability to access the data, the ability to move in and rapidly create new programs. We're so far away from being ready at that scale. And managing that organizational complexity, I think, is almost bigger than dealing with new technologies.
Yeah. I think that's part of the fear. Well, I think the reason why data isn't being transparently shared is because the reality is there's better businesses out there to know what to do with it and how to leverage it and how to make operations far more efficient. And I think that's the protectionist mentality still, isn't it? Either.
Yeah, I told you about my plans. I had a book afoot to write about the energy transition on a global basis. I was telling you about that last time we talked. That's poking along. It's not easy to launch a book, but there is talk about doing a podcast. So I may get involved with that. But I love the idea of talking about these energy transition issues worldwide, because think about how electricity is a regional issue, subject to local laws and governance, subject to local weather, climate patterns, and so on. What's the existing incumbency in the power system from country to country? And there's no lock on innovation. It's not all in North America or Europe or anything. And innovation can happen anywhere. And then a key aspect with innovation is, how does it get circulated? And right now, I think a real challenge we have in the energy transition is the pigeonholing of energy innovation. Good ideas don't get discovered fast enough. They don't get shared. You take a consulting organization whose IP is their innovation and their new processes, and they're not going to open that up. And yet, this is the argument between open and closed systems. And the more we can share and maybe begin to benchmark global standards on innovation and new approaches, the better off we could be, right? But that doesn't happen without some organization. And I think that's one of the key challenges we have, is some crazy new thing. Like, I've been doing a lot of work or talking to a lot of Australians, and there's so much innovation down there, but it's a small, relatively small, isolated national economy with some unique issues. Like they just have massive residential solar. And so they're dealing with what that means on the grid, and they have big resilience issues. And what are they doing with wildfires and outages and things like that? How do we get those ideas over there, where they're maybe doing something radically different, into the U.S. economy? And that's, I guess, the subject of a whole other podcast.
Yeah. So you're obviously well-read, John, and well-researched. Do you have any favorite sources of information that you'd recommend people check out? Any newsletters, books, podcasts?
I'd like to say I was a year ago, I'd be better at answering that. Like I said, my daughter just got married. I don't know. I shared with you. I just recovered from open heart surgery 6 months ago. So I feel a little bit out of the picture. I don't read as nearly as much as I used to. I think there's some tremendous podcast out there, and I think it's pretty subjective. I would look at getting organized, right? I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the energy field to have a go-to list of newsletters, subscriptions, specialized, industry special, but also general. I'm a big fan of The Economist, as one of the best publications out there, The Guardian, both British publications. But I think we should be reading across the board, tracking the global issues, and tracking all these subject areas, and putting together a good list of podcasts and newsletters. There's only so many white papers you can consume or find time, right? But you need to find a healthy balance and spend at least an hour a day just keeping up with what's going on.
So last primary question, John, you've touched on, well, you've obviously had a very diverse and incredible career. You've just gone through open heart surgery. Your daughter's just got married. The final question, from a personal, professional perspective, in my life, I will have been successful when ... How would you finish that?
Well, I'll tell a real quick story, because I know we're at the end. I was a broadband consultant in the middle of the aughts, the 2000s, after the Genie project. And as the bottom fell out in the citywide wireless perspective, I was looking to get back into energy, but also I was driving a Civic Hybrid and doing I was conscious about the climate. And at that time I had 2 kids in middle school. And I watched this viral video called The Story of Stuff, which was by a global environmentalist about climate change. and the material economy. And it really moved me. And I sat down and had a family meeting and told the kids I was going to get out of communications and back into energy. This is early January '08, and focus on climate change and do what I could to gain influence and make a difference at that level, because I firmly believe as a parent, that's a responsibility we have to the next generation. I didn't cause the problem, but I have a chance to do something. And so that became really in my early 50s a way to focus my career. I knew what I was getting up for in the morning, right? Yep. To do this. And it was a very long haul project. But I think I accomplished a lot of that. Most of my writing came after that. And I gained some influence and a voice with books and chapters and articles and so on. And so I'll keep doing that, maybe not at the old pace. But I recommend everybody get a passion. And it's hard to have a bigger passion than solving an insolvable problem, right? It's like, for me, it's like wine, understanding wine and golf. I'll never finish, right? And so that really is a great life lesson, I think, is pick something that you're passionate about and go after it. And it's really good if what you're passionate about is somewhat service oriented, so that everyone will be better off for your efforts.
Love that. It's a great way to end. John, it's been a pleasure. There's lots of other rabbit warrens we'll go down in future recordings, I imagine, but this has been a pleasure.
Let's do it again. And if I get this podcast started, you'll have to come on mine.
Sounds great.
I know you have a lot to say, Gareth. Thank you very much. And to the audience, I hope our paths cross.
Cheers, John. Thanks.
Thanks.
Dan, John's quite the legend, isn't he?
Yeah. Thinking about someone that has been addressing this problem for as long as he has, or thinking about methods of addressing it and working within utilities is pretty impressive. I also really like this convergence of energy and communications, because I think that's going to be a key aspect. And we're already seeing it with demand response programs, but I think it's still really the early days of utilities communicating out to the demand, versus just shipping electrons to them. I'm eager to see how this continues to play out.
Yeah, I think the energy transition is not possible without the digital transition, and vice versa. The digital transition, as John alludes to, consumes a huge amount of power, but then without that digital capability, the energy transition isn't going to be scalable and achieve what is hugely possible. And excited to actually dig into that throughout this season, because I think that's definitely a macro trend that we all need to be aware of. I think for me, the big takeaway from John was the reiteration that utilities are big behemoths. They've got rules of engagement. The game rules have been set, and it's hard for them to challenge and break that. And as a result, they're having to play the game that they've been given, which is deploy billions of dollars into major infrastructure projects, which take years to decades in the making and end up passing on a lot of cost to us as ratepayers, but also creating an ever more complex, big system for us to manage and figure out. And I think with that comes a huge opportunity for businesses to take control of their own energy situation. What are your thoughts on what John was saying around that?
Yeah. Let's not forget that at least the US grid is the biggest machine in the history of man. Like that is, it's not something that we should overlook. I think that the biggest thing that I took away, that I think has historically not been something that business leaders have had to think about, is taking an inventory of their systems that rely on energy. And namely, he had spoken about categorizing them into critical, as things that just simply cannot have a disruption, to priority, that are portions of their operations that ideally do not have a disruption, and then discretionary, as things that, if it goes out for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, not the end of the world. I don't think historically many business leaders have had to think about that. And then shifting or flipping the entire paradigm on its head, where we've always thought that we needed backups to when the grid goes out. So often this comes in the form of backup generators, flipping that dynamic on its head where you are your own power producer and you store your own energy and you just simply use the grid as backup in case your own systems fail, which is pretty empowering at the same time. Like it's something that for the history of electric utilities, they've delivered a product to us and we've just consumed it. And now we can be our own power producer and let them serve as our backup. And ultimately it's going to make the entire system that much more resilient, affordable, clean, dynamic. So that's really what I'm excited and what drives me every day to make this happen.
Yep, love it. And I think the vision for where John saw this going 20 years ago is still playing out. And I think the opportunity for us all to be prosumers and transacting and energy just to be so abundant that we can use it however we see fit is hugely exciting and something that we need to keep striving towards. So game on.
Yeah.
Great.
Cheers to John for pioneering this for many decades at this point.
Exactly. Appreciate you, John. Thanks, Dan. See you next time.
Yeah. Take care.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.